Morning, Orion.
Good morning.
Caught you by surprise there.
Yes,
Today
indeed.
Is Tuesday, February 3rd, 2009. My name is Mark Depew. I'm a volunteer with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And this is a continuation of a series of interviews we had with Orion yesterday about your experiences in being the voice of agriculture for over 50 years, and nearly 50 of those at WGN Radio.
Getting close, 2010, God willing and the boss willing.
Well, we had to stop rather abruptly for one of those peculiar things, like you had to be on the radio yesterday, and we were talking about, we'd just gotten you to China. We were going through all the different countries. How many countries have you been in the world?
43 countries that I have visited in the years that I've been here at WGN, and we've taken a television crew to nearly all of those countries. My first trip to China, I could not take a TV crew along. They wouldn't allow it. But
well, tell me about that trip.
It was a fascinating trip. Governor Jim Thompson decided that even though we had not renewed diplomatic relations with China, we still had not...
what year was that?
That was 1978, and we went in April. And I think it was November of that year where the U.S. government finally recognized the People's Republic of China. But when we were there, we did not officially recognize China. But Governor Thompson said, at that point, I think there were 800 million people, at best guess, in China. And he said they're going to need food, they're going to need agricultural technology, they're going to need seed, they're going to need equipment. And so we ought to go over there and let them know that Illinois has the goods that they're going to need, whether it be tractors, combines, and that sort of thing. And so he appointed, I think there were 14 of us, or 18. There were 18 of us, representing Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, some of the other commodity groups. And I was invited to go along on the trip. All I could take on that trip was an 8mm camera, because the Chinese had allowed an Italian film crew to come in the year before with 16mm film, and they shot a documentary and took it back to Italy and put it together, and it was just devastating to China. So the thinking in China was, if anybody comes in with a 16mm camera, look out for them, because they're going to hurt us. So I did take in an 8mm, the best one we could find, and we did come back with usable video of what it was like on the farm. But we spent 2 weeks in China, and in northern China, where it was still cold, snow was on the ground. We had 3 guide interpreters. We had a gentleman in his late 40s who was a member of the Communist Party, Mr. Yen. And then he had 2 younger associates who were not members. And it was not all that easy to become a member of the Communist Party. You really had to work and prove yourself.
And this isn't too far after the Cultural Revolution.
No, it isn't. As a matter of fact, it was relatively close to the Cultural Revolution, and when life had really been disrupted in colleges and universities, and the 2 young associates were trying to impress Mr. Yen that they ought to become a member of the Communist Party. So we did get into some interesting discussions with Mr. Yen, and we kind of went back and forth at each other on the whole trip. Never angry, but we were making
the benefits of capitalism versus socialism.
Versus socialism. And he kept telling me that everybody in China is equal, and we'd go out to the communes, the farm communes, and you'd walk into one room with 2 shelves on the wall that were beds for the people who lived there, and you had a round hole in a raised concrete structure, and you put your fire inside there, and you did the cooking over the hole, and then you had a table and a couple of chairs. And even at that point, they were beginning to curtail population growth, and so in the Chinese culture, it was important to have a son, a male heir, and so they wouldn't talk about it, but it was obvious that very often baby girls ended up in the irrigation canals because they knew they could have one child. But it was an absolutely fascinating trip. I saw a world that I didn't realize existed. We stayed in the Peking Hotel where foreign guests stayed. That was the only place we could stay. And the capital was still called Peking at the time. And so the first day I'm there, I'm on the 14th floor, and I open the window and look out at the street below me. And it is filled with bicycles. As far as the eye can see, it is bicycles. And whoever built the main thoroughfare, it was an 8-lane thoroughfare. And the 4 outer lanes, it was 10 lanes, the 4 outer lanes on each side for bicycle traffic. And then they put the vehicle traffic in the 2 middle lanes. So it was a circus watching from up there as these cars would come down the middle lane and then have to turn right in front of 4 lanes of bicycles. And how they kept from killing people, I never ever did figure out. But the Chairman Mao had died by that time. I spent a very interesting Easter Sunday there. And because there were 2 churches serving the Western Diplomatic Corps. And so I went to church, conducted by a Chinese minister who somehow had survived the purge. I still don't know. It was conducted in Chinese, and there were Africans there, and there were Germans, and there were Norwegians, and there was our group. And then there was a Catholic church that served the community. So in the morning, we worshipped our God, and then in the afternoon we were taken to the tomb of Chairman Mao, where his body was on display. And it was unbelievable to see Tiananmen Square filled with people, but all standing in military platoon files. You know, they were
civilians.
Civilians. Yeah, they were waiting to see Chairman Mao. And they were orderly, and there was no moving around. They stood in line, and they'd be in groups, and then they'd be moved forward. Well, we had 9 cars for our group. We had 2 Americans in the back seat of each car, and a madman behind the steering wheel. We had some riding experiences that were unbelievable. But anyway, we were driven right up to the head of the lines. We got out, and we got in line, and there were 2 lines going on each side of Chairman Mao's body. And as I walked by, I looked across at the other line, and crying, tears rolling down their cheeks. And I finished that night, and I wrote a letter to my pastor saying, well, today I saw the Chinese worship their God, and I had the opportunity to worship mine. It culturally was just fascinating, and I wore cowboy boots on the whole trip, and I'm a fairly tall person. And Chinese kids just stared because they'd never, if you're under 30 years of age, you hadn't seen Americans really, because it had been closed to us until '72 when Nixon went over there for the first time. So one of the things we did, we took a purebred boar from Illinois to China, because we knew that China had 240 million pigs. Here in the U.S., 60 million is about the average number at any one time. But these pigs were just running loose. They weren't being fed for food. They were being used for fertilizer. Because whenever a pig dropped its thing, somebody picked it up and put it on the field if the pig wasn't already on the field. And so I described the pig as the ugliest pig I'd ever seen, the Meson breed, and we have brought them back to the University of Illinois for research. And the Meson pig was ugly, and it was probably 300 pounds of lard hanging on a backbone, is what it was. And so we took the boar over there to go to an agricultural school with the idea that they would begin a breeding program, and then when they were able to import corn and soybeans from us, they'd get into a nutrition feeding program. And that would be the beginning of the exports to that country, and so it was a goodwill gesture. We named the boar Big Jim, and when we got out to the university hog farm, it was a government hog farm. Everything was government. And I saw the Meson pig, ugliest pig I've ever seen. somebody in our group said, we're going to have to put a paper bag over Big Jim's head before he'll make love to that. You know, it was an ugly pig. But the thing that it had, in this country, I think average litter size would be 9 baby pigs. That pig did 25 to 28 baby pigs.
Wow.
Didn't have enough faucets to feed them all. But, you know, that was, I mean, we had some animals. Well, we had Dr. Orville Bentley, Dean of the College of Agriculture at the University of Illinois, with us, and we had some other university scientists, and they were just astounded, you know, with this. Big Jim lived 6 months because they have a disease in that country, a cat disease, transmissible to pigs that we don't have in this country, and so there was no immunity. And so we don't know how many offspring Big Jim was able to breed while he was alive over there, but that was one of getting Big Jim into the country through Japan, because we had to land at Tokyo for refueling before we went into Shanghai, and it was an interesting time. The one other, well, there are many memorable moments, but the other one that I'll take time for, we kept, they arranged the areas that we would visit and pretty much dictated where we would go and what we could do. We went to a tractor factory in Changchun, China, which is a little town of 3.5 million people. Tallest building in town was 3 stories. And so we visited the tractor factory. I got a very unique picture there, a picture of Hans Beckerer, who later became CEO of Deere & Company at Moline. I got him sitting on a red tractor in China, so I've sort of blackmailed. I mean, a green tractor guy doesn't sit on a red tractor. But we kept saying we want to go to an agricultural university, and we got all sorts of reasons. No, the roads are too bad, it's too far, and you can't, we just can't take you to the university or the college. We knew why. It had been totally disrupted by the Cultural Revolution. The professors had been sent to the fields. And so we kept insisting, and finally they said, we'll bring the professors to you. And we were in Changchun, China, which is in the northern part of the country. We were staying in a hotel they opened for us that had been there a long time. And the more we walked around, it was a magnificent hotel at one time. It was in total disrepair now. No heat, and in March it was in the 20s. And we finally determined it was a rest camp for Japanese officers when the Army occupied that part of China. And so that's where the Japanese officers would come and spend their R&R time. And had been an indoor swimming pool. It was filled with broken furniture now. A rug that was about 40 by 60 feet in the entryway that was, you could tell had been absolutely beautiful. It was so dirty and stained and everything that there was no way you could ever get it back. But they brought the professors. They brought 14 professors. And it was like watching a man in the desert dying of thirst suddenly finding water. I was just astounded because all of them had been educated in the United States. And when we introduced Dean Orville Bentley to them from the University of Illinois, they just literally grabbed him and they said, is this professor still alive? Is this professor still at Purdue? Is this professor still at Minnesota? And it was just phenomenal to watch it happen because they'd all gone to school here in the 40s before the communist takeover, and then had gone back and had had no contact since because of it. And they stayed till 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was just phenomenal to watch. And then the next morning, 2 of them came back and brought soybean seed from their experimental farm because the soybean originated in China and it was brought to this country by Henry Ford. And that started a dialogue that, continues to this day. Dean Orville Bentley goes to China once a year and spends 2 weeks over there working. He's an animal scientist, and he works with, or not Dean Bentley now, it's Dean Bob Easter. And he's over there for 2 weeks every year working with the Chinese on nutrition. And it all really started, I think, with that visit in 1978.
Well, that is fascinating. I assume that all of the places you went in terms of farms were collective farms. I wonder if you could reflect on the contrast you saw on those collective farms versus what you knew in the United States at that time.
It was impossible to make a comparison because there was nothing there that, from a structural standpoint, an infrastructure standpoint, a technology standpoint, that was like anything we had seen here. The families lived in these one room. Now the building would probably be 200 feet long, and it'd be one room and one room and one room, and that's where the families would live. Schooling was arranged, of course, and taken care of. Many of the children, as they matured and were ready to go into other school, were taken from the parents, and they were taken to schools in cities so they could be properly educated after they had passed tests that showed they had real potential. And in some cases, they would never see their parents again. And I managed to talk to one set of parents who spoke some English, and I said, "Do your children go away?" And they said, "Yeah." And depending on their ability as an athlete or their ability as a student, why, the government takes care of all that. The method of production was all hand labor. The farms, the fields are very small. The farms may be large, but the farms at one time were small farms that were owned and then totally taken over by the government. And so while the fields are small, the farms now are very, very large. And they were given an assignment. They had to produce so much rice or so much whatever the crop. They were assigned. They made no decision on what they would plant. That was all assigned from the central government in Peking. And then they had to meet that goal. And then whatever they raised over it, then they could use, to feed themselves and to feed the commune. But as I looked in these one-room homes, I finally said to Mr. Yan, I said, "So this is the way Chinese people live." "Yes, this is the way, and they're taken care of. They pay no rent, and medicine is free." And I said, "What about Chairman Mao? Did he live like that?" "Oh, yes, he certainly did." And I said, "Well, let me tell you how I live." I said, "I have a 3-bedroom home. I have 2 automobiles, and I said I use an airplane to get to many of my meetings." And because he'd been irritating me, and so I kind of laid it on him. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, then you are part of the 4% of the imperialists who live wealthy, and the other 96% live in extreme poverty in your country." He said, "You're just part of 4%. We know what your country does to people who are poor." And that was the exchange that we had.
And there was no convincing him otherwise, was there?
No convincing him otherwise. And I said to him, "I hope someday you can come to America and you can come to my house and you can see not only me, but all of my neighbors who pretty much live the same way." And I said, "I am not considered a wealthy person in my country. I am considered comfortable, but not wealthy." He never did accept it. The other thing that was interesting, we did fly Chinese airlines at times to get to where we were going. And they were Russian airplanes, versions of the 727 that we had in this country. It was the Russian airplane. And the first time we did, I got into the airplane, and I couldn't sit because the seats were too close, and I was too tall. I could get halfway down in the seat, and that was it. And I said, "Mr. Yan," I said, I can't sit." "Oh, okay, well, follow me." So we went to the front of the airplane, and there was a first class in the front of the airplane. And I turned to Mr. Yan, and I said, "I thought you said everybody was the same. Here's a first." No, this is for military people. They can spread their maps out so they can work while they're flying."
I would guess you didn't believe him that Mao was living the same way as...
Of course not. Of course not. It simply wasn't true.
Tell us about some of the other places, and I'm especially curious to hear your reactions and your opinions about what's going on in South America, in particular Brazil and Argentina.
It's an interesting story because in 1960, when I came to WGN, Brazil and Argentina was South America, and certainly no factor. It was nothing that we were interested in because they weren't a factor in the world market production and that sort of thing. And it was after the soybean embargo that President Nixon imposed in the early 70s that Japan said, hey, we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. We need soybeans for cooking oil for the human diet. And now they've shut it down, and we can't take a chance on their government doing this to us again. So they started looking for a place in the world that had the climate and the soil we did, and they found Brazil first, and then they found Argentina. But they started in Brazil, and they put millions of yen into developing a soybean industry in Brazil. And literally, we were alone in the soybean export market with no competition. And by the mid-'80s, late 80s, they were a factor. So now we have to start paying attention to them. We pay attention to their weather at this time of year. When it's winter here, we watch their weather. In this year, we're looking at an extreme drought in Argentina, and it's affecting our prices at the Board of Trade every day until they get rain. And so now we have to pay attention. And so then we decided we're going to have to go down there and see for ourselves what the land is like, what the farmers are like, and how serious a threat they are to our producers in the export market. So my partner Max and I made several trips down to Brazil and Argentina. Max has gone into Argentina more than I have, but these are farmers that know what they're doing, and they have the acres. They have millions of acres. And I'm not talking about clearing the Amazon to grow soybeans. They've got more than enough acres to grow without cutting the Amazon. And they have all of the technology. The American companies now have moved down there. Manufacturers of farm equipment are there with factories, and the grain companies, the Cargills and the ADMs and the Bunge's are all down there doing the marketing. And it's gotten to the point where, interestingly enough, American soybean growers say, okay, they are our competition, but maybe we can work together in researching soybeans and in promoting and marketing soybeans. And so there are some joint ventures between their association and our associations that are working in India to improve diets there with soybean protein, working in Africa where there's a lot of work being done, particularly in the AIDS communities. And so we've had the opportunity to go down, get a first-hand look at it, and understand that they're going to be around. They're not going away. And so we have to learn to work with them at the same time we compete with them. But again, the one thing about farmers that is universal, I have yet to meet one that makes enough money. But then I don't make enough either, and nobody else does. We all think we should make more than we're making, probably. But that's universal with farmers, not making enough money. And secondly, they don't like government. But they still have to depend on government to very often, make a living during difficult times.
I would guess also that each one of them is complaining about the current weather conditions or something else, the current roll of the dice. Maybe that's the way to put it.
I think it is. The one thing about farmers, too, and I say this lovingly because I grew up on a farm, and I remember how my dad thought and how I thought growing up on the farm, that you're always worried about tomorrow. And so in a lot of my speeches, I tell, like, last year, when we had record high prices for the commodities, I said, take a minute to enjoy it. Because I'd say, hey, this is pretty good, isn't it? Yeah, but, what's going to happen next year? And so I say, take a minute to enjoy it. And then you can worry about next year. But, my golly, you got to have a little fun with it once in a while. But I think it's a farmer's nature. because you're battling the unknown. You're battling weather, and you have no idea what that's going to do to you. You're battling government policy, not only our government, but governments around the world. We still have the European Union that will not let genetically modified plants come into the market in the European Union. We cannot ship hormone-fed beef to the European Union, and that's totally out of our control, but it has an impact on what we do.
Would you agree with this statement that the American farmer is the ultimate entrepreneur?
Oh, absolutely. And the ultimate risk taker. A few years ago, one of the big farm organizations decided to hold its convention in Las Vegas. And I went on the air and I said, why would farmers go to Las Vegas? They've got more than enough gambling on their own farm or ranch every day. So why go to Las Vegas, the gambling mecca? You're gambling every day. But yeah, they are entrepreneurs. And the other thing that farmers do, if I were an agricultural engineer designing tractors or combines or other high technology machines and spent my whole career developing this combine, I would be frustrated as all get out, because I know the minute a farmer buys that combine, he's going to find something to change on that combine to make it work a little bit better for him, because farmers are innovators. They've had to over the years, and now they like it. We've got GPS. I remember growing up seeing a cartoon in a farm magazine of ma and pa farmers standing at the edge of a field watching this tractor without a cab and without a driver moving up and down the field. No driver, no hands. It was funny. It was a cartoon. Today it's happening. And the technology that is coming down the line is just speeding up tremendously.
I wanted to shift gears and take you back into a few of those years when they were losing the roll of the dice, and that's the 1980s. And I wonder if you could talk through some of the challenges that farmers had during those years.
We came out of the 70s when it was plant fence row to fence row, and we had gotten into the export market, and it was the golden age of agriculture in the minds of some people. Earl Butz was our Secretary of Agriculture and a tremendous spokesman for agriculture and explaining what agriculture was doing and needed to do to feed people. And
then we got a farmer in the White House.
Then we got a farmer, and we also had a farmer Secretary of Agriculture, John Block, during the Reagan administration. And we went from inflation. In the 70s, it was buy all the land you can and pay it back with cheaper dollars because inflation will be with us forever. And you'd go to a country bank or you'd go to Farm Credit and say, I need a $100,000 operating loan, and they'd say, hey, you can have $200,000. It's there and it's cheap credit.
You recall what the inflation rate was in the late 70s, early 80s?
I don't recall the inflation rate, but I do remember early 80s when we hit a 21% prime rate. And that's when the world turned around. And it's interesting because you see the parallel today in the housing industry, and it proves we ought to pay more attention to history. We just don't learn. But in the 80s, we had farms that were valued up to here, and the mortgage was valued up to here. And then came the 21% prime rate, and then came the decline in demand. The value of the farm started to go down, down, and down, but the mortgage was still up here. And it got to the point where mortgages on farms were higher than the value of the farm. And then that's when the foreclosures really started. Banks were operating under laws that said, you have to do this or we're going to have to foreclose. And we went through the shout-downs and on the courthouse steps. Every night on television you'd see another foreclosure, and it was just a terrible disruptive time in agriculture. We come out of the golden age. Times are good. They'll always be good. We come into this terrible time. I lost track of the number of letters I got from parents saying, boy, if there's one thing I do before I die, it's to make sure my kids don't be involved in farming. Don't want my kids to go through the pain and the hurt that we're going through, and so I'm not going to let my kids farm. That's the last thing I want them to do. And I heard that time and again.
Was there a reduction in demand?
There was a reduction in demand because we had produced so much. I would say we had overproduced. The demand held fairly strong, but we were just producing a lot more.
Well, I know Payment in Kind program came in
program.
1983. Tell us a little bit about that.
Complicated. I didn't have to do it, but farmers did. And one thing farmers know how to do is to farm government programs. And John Block was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, and it was, I just can't really explain it. I never really understood the PIC program. But there were moves where if you did this if you lived in Illinois but you did this trading in South Dakota or North Dakota or Minnesota, you could play the cards on that and the PIC program. PIC program, I think, did help a lot of people. Served its purpose
to reduce supply.
To reduce supply and to bring some stability back to prices. But the thing that agriculture didn't do was run off to Washington and say, you've got to do something about the mortgages, you've got to do something about this and that. And the farm credit system that was on the verge of total failure managed to bring itself out of it. And by the end of the decade, we'd had some transformation of farm owners. Those that were heavily mortgaged and not good managers were gone. They lost it. They moved to town, but it brought in some younger farmers who now were looking at land that was very cheap compared to what it had been at the start of the 80s. And so we had this movement where some of the farmers were gone, but others were there to take their place. And as you look back on it, one person said, it's kind of like a forest fire. It burns what's there, but then once the fire is over, the next crop comes on.
Well, it's interesting. You're in China in 1978, and you see that system.
Yeah.
You come back to the United States and experience the whole 1980s, and you see the painful side of capitalism, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it was very painful. And you'd go on the air and you'd empathize with farmers who were in trouble. But on the other hand, you had to try to help and encourage those who were doing a good management job. And it wasn't always their fault for getting into trouble. I remember a letter that I got from a farmer up in central Wisconsin. And he and his wife had a dairy farm, successful dairy farm, fully paid for. Son got married, came back from the university, and wanted to go into the business with the family. Family mortgaged the paid-for farm to add more cows, to build an additional barn, and to get all of this in place so that it could support two families. And now the whole thing was going down. Just simply going down and not making it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
Your light went off too, and I forgot to unplug this.
Okay, just a very quick technical break here. What I wanted to mention here, and we were just talking about the hard times of the 80s, I read that 1986, maybe that was one of the deepest years. Prices were at 51% of parity, and I would think anybody's going to have a hard time making a profit in years like that.
Especially if they had a debt. There were some farmers who were debt-free, and so they just kept doing what they were doing. But yeah, it was with that kind of a pricing situation.
And I guess not too surprising then that Will and Nelson and others decided we need to do something to help our farmers, and they started these farm aid concerts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can. I never attended one. I was not impressed by the idea. And when we tried to follow up with the people who put the farm aid concerts together to see how the money was being spent to help farmers, because I would get, I think the first farm aid concert that was announced, I got letters and phone calls from farmers saying, well, how do we apply to get some of that money to help us through this tough time? And I could never get an answer from the promoters of the farm aid concert on, what you do to get to get money. And they would keep putting me off when I'd say, well, where is it going? What is it doing? And finally, the best answer that I could get after 2 or 3 years of trying was the fact that, well, it's going to pay legal expenses to do all of this to improve conditions for farmers and to legislate new laws on foreclosures and that sort of thing. There were great entertainment venues and fine with Willie and John Mellencamp and all the rest of them who donated. I think they donated their time, and that's fine. They were great concerts. They did draw a lot of attention, but when it came down to physically helping farmers, I could never find that this farm family that was on the verge of losing the farm got a $100,000 check from Farm Aid and it saved the farm. I could never, ever find that. So,
what was it that finally turned the corner for American agriculture, that pulled them out of those doldrum years?
Prices improved, smarter managers, people who went through the 80s without incurring a lot of debt, and they were in pretty good financial shape, and so they would acquire farms that were next to them that were in difficulty. And Farm Credit System got rid of its bad loans without a bailout from Congress, and came back stronger than ever in the 90s. And it comes back once again also to what I keep saying. Prices never go the same way forever. Mm-hmm. There's always the change. There's always the price correction. And the mindset we get into when times are good, we think they'll always be good. And when times are bad, we think they'll always be bad. And then the word change comes in, and it begins to turn around.
Well, the one thing I do know about American agriculture, they didn't produce less soybeans or corn or beef cattle or hogs. So was there a growth in the market?
I think foreign markets improved, and we were doing a better job of promoting sales to foreign markets. The Soybean Association, the corn growers, the Grains Council would take groups of farmers to Asia, to Europe, and into Africa, and promote our protein feeds for their livestock and poultry industries. Mm-hmm. And just a combination of things. It's about that time, too, that we started talking about alternative fuel and started talking about, well, we called it gasohol at first, and then it became ethanol, and then soy diesel, and it became biodiesel because we don't just use soybeans to produce that.
Well, we certainly want to talk a lot in depth about those issues here as we get farther along. I would like to have you talk a little bit about the Freedom of Farm Act, 1996, I believe. And you've emphasized how important that has been.
To me, that was the beginning of change in agricultural policy, because up to that point, agricultural policy was based on you had to grow corn, you had to grow soybeans, you had to grow wheat, and whether the market was there for it or not. That's how the programs were put together. You had to keep records. You had to be in constant touch with your county ASCS office, as it was called then. It's now the Farm Service Agency. And the programs really were geared to encouraging farmers to produce grains that weren't needed. And so...
Orion, this sounds like what was going on in China in 1978 when you visited.
It does. It does. And, of course, it wasn't called communism. It wasn't even called socialism.
It was called government bureaucracy, maybe?
Yeah, it was. And, the rules that you had to follow. And wherever you get that kind of programs, you get some people, Billy Saul Estes, the Texas entrepreneur who just did all kinds of bad things with the cotton program, and when that exploded, the scandal was horrendous, and that brought people looking at the farm programs and how they're administered pretty much today like banks, and how banks are doing business and that sort of thing. And because if you farmed those government programs, you could do very, very well. And while producers kept saying, we don't want our money from the government, we want it from the market. But if we can't get it from the market, we'll take it from the government. And so that's pretty much how we had geared the programs. Then came 1996, and Bill Clinton was president. We had Mike Espy as Secretary of Agriculture, who didn't stay around too long. And then Dan Glickman, the Kansas congressman, became Secretary of Agriculture. And we had people in Congress like Charlie Stenholm from Texas, a Blue Dog Democrat. And we had Republican senators on the committee, and they started saying there's got to be another way, because if we say you have to produce a product for which the market is not there, then we're back into the surplus business and the storage business and all of that. And so they loosened the reins on what you planted. They encouraged planting for what the market demanded, and then setting a level where if the price dropped below that, then there would be some assistance, but it wasn't going to amount to nearly what it was under the previous system. And that basically hasn't changed that much today. The latest farm bill that we wrote and came into being in 2008 really has more to do with feeding people than sending checks to farmers. Nearly 2/3 of the budget of the U.S. Department of Agriculture today is food stamps and nutrition programs for children and that sort of thing. So the amount of money being paid to farmers today is really down dramatically. And with record high prices in 2008, there was very little that went to farmers. Now that'll change because prices are lower, and so there is that support level there. But the current program really is based more on energy, developing energy, renewable sources of energy. A lot of research money that's going into that area. It's also being spent on the farmers who were basically left out of farm programs. The green industry, producers of fruits and vegetables, never really had any kind of a farm program. And not even money for research that would improve the production and quality of what they were producing. That is a part of the new farm bill. So I would say the farm bill that was written back in 1990 or in the 80s, far different than what we're looking at today in a farm bill. And the reason they like to keep the food stamp program in a farm bill, that way you've got city congressmen and senators that will say, okay, to get what we want for nutrition for our people, yeah, we'll give you this and we'll give you that. Because if you take the nutrition part of the program out of the USDA budget, farmers have very little leverage on Capitol Hill, very little.
And that's a trend because 150 years ago, 40 or 50% of Americans were engaged in farming
at least,
directly.
Yeah, 50%.
And 2% today. Does it bother you, though, that the farmers seem to have such a small voice when you consider what percentage of Illinois' working population is directly or indirectly engaged in agricultural business ventures?
Well, if you take it from the farm to the supermarket and everybody in between, then about 22% of the workforce derives a living from agriculture, agribusiness. But if you just look at the production part of it, Illinois would be pretty much on par with the national average, 2% population. But then you've got, you've got the ADMs and you've got the Deeres and the Case IHs and you've got the fertilizer people and all that. So there are a lot more people that are directly involved in the production side of agriculture. It's the production, processing, retailing that makes up about 22%.
Would you agree with the statement that agriculture today, though, does not have a proportional voice in politics?
Oh, I would fully agree with that. and that trend is downward. Until we have something like last year where there was the threat of food shortages, which were blown out of proportion. It was Walmart that started, we won't sell you more than 20 pounds of rice and all that sort of thing. And we had more than enough rice. The thing about farmers, if the economic incentive is there, they can quickly change what they plant, because if corn brings better money than soybeans, hey, you bet we can plant corn.
Let's go back to the 1996 Act, and my very basic understanding, one of the things that was changed at that time was that the commodity price supports was supposed to gradually disappear. I think it was a 7-year window.
Right.
Did that actually occur?
Yeah, it did.
So that would be a huge change for agriculture as well.
Yeah, well, that was the change in 96, because when you start planting and growing for what the market demands, then you're going to bring prices to a level where the subsidies do begin to phase out. To me, the basic change in 96 was freedom to plant what you want to plant. You don't have to plant corn in order to be a participant in the government farm program. And to me, that was the big change, and so that would phase out the subsidy payments.
Wonder if you could talk a little bit about, explain to us that perfect storm that hit hog farmers. I think it was 1998.
Yeah. Demand wasn't there. We weren't doing anything in the export market with pork. Weren't exporting any of it. Production was high because feed costs were low, and we just continued producing pork to the point where we didn't have enough packing plants that could process the hogs that were ready for market every week. Weights would then go up. If the hogs couldn't go to market this week, they'd be on feed for next week, and so your weight would be up. And you just, it was an upward spiral on supply and a downward spiral on the price, because the supply-demand really came to play. And we saw hog prices down to 9-10 cents a pound.
But was there the farmers were guessing wrong that the market would continue to grow for hogs?
I'm not sure what went through their mind. I think the corn price was low enough that they could make, they thought, more money marketing their corn as pork rather than just marketing corn. And so they would feed it and they would add. And it was about that time that we started building larger hog farms that just really specialized in hog production. A lot of them didn't even do their own feed production. They would depend on neighbors to do that, and they would just concentrate on the hog feeding end of it. And the expansion, I remember flying the Cessna across Iowa and across northern Iowa, looking down and seeing long barns that you knew were the barns for the housing the hogs. And every time you'd fly out that way, you'd see more of them being built. It was a time of expansion, and demand simply didn't keep up with it because we weren't in the export market. Now today, export market for pork is probably taking 20 to 26% of our total production. You put that up against nothing 10 years ago, and it makes a major difference. And Mexico is our biggest buyer. Matter of fact, Mexico is the biggest buyer of pork and beef from the United States.
China is a growing market. India?
Those countries, not much in the way of meat. They do more importing of, China, soybeans. They buy more soybeans, of our soybeans, than any other country.
To use for hog feed and cattle feed, I would think.
Yeah, and human food. They take the oil, for the cooking and the diet. But yes, they are using soybean meal for growing livestock, because milk has never really been a part of the Chinese diet. But they're developing a like for milk, so you're seeing dairy farms go in. You're seeing China's corn acreage expand. But again, back to China, that is such a huge market. But the challenge that the Chinese government has is immense, because you can't move the people off the farms. because then you get the problem in the cities. And so instead of mechanizing, you have to keep a lot of hand labor on those farms, and it does limit production. When we visited there in 1978, the thing they talked about more than anything else that they needed was fertilizer. And they were building, at the time we were there, 14 fertilizer plants. And to those, that's one thing I say to people in this country who say, well, we ought not use chemical fertilizer, and we ought not put this on the soil and all that. Well, China has a 4,500-year history of just putting hog manure on their farms. Take a look at how their soil has been mined of all of the nutrients it needs to grow corn, soybeans, and that. If you're going to grow corn and soybeans, they take nitrogen, they take potash, they take phosphate. You got to put it back. And that was their greatest need, and I think they have reached the point now where they are using more fertilizer. But you still can't mechanize to the extent that would make their agriculture a lot more efficient. So there's still a critical market for us.
Have you been back to China the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, I've since '78 I've been there 10 times.
Talk to us about the difference that you've seen in agriculture in China then.
It's a different country every time I go back. It changes. But the bigger changes are in the cities. Shanghai, for example, that when I was there in '96 with Secretary Glickman on his trade mission, the mayor of Shanghai took us on a boat tour of the harbor, and she said 20% of all of the building cranes in the world were in Shanghai. And we stayed in a new hotel that was about 50 stories tall, and looking out the window, that's all you saw, building cranes. You saw all the little homes that were being torn down and the building cranes. So the changes that I've seen every time I go back, you see more in the city than you do on the farm. You still don't see much mechanization on the farms.
Are they still collective farms?
They are. They are. And the other thing that makes them so difficult for big machinery, because we've got John Deere over there manufacturing, and we've got ADM over there with plants that are processing, and the farms are filled with ditches, either to irrigate or to take water away for drainage. And those ditches are big enough that you just don't roll combines or tractors over the. So they would have to restructure the farmland itself in many instances to bring in the kind of equipment that is commonplace on an American farm. And if they do that too quickly, then what do you do with all the laborers? Send them to the city, and the cities are growing so rapidly anyway that it's got to be a tightrope for the Chinese government. It really does. And we hope they succeed because they're an important market.
And from everything we've heard recently that I've been reading about the explosion in their economy and their incredible growth that they've had, one of the results of that is they've developed a liking for meat.
Yes, they have. And we like that.
I would think that hog farmers in the United States could see a tremendous growth in that particular market.
Yes, because they tend to eat more pork than beef, and of course poultry is an important part of what they eat. My first trip over there, I was a guest of honor at one of the meals, and I ate the head of the chicken, and I didn't eat the legs, but that's the thing that they do. On one of my trips over there, I was sitting in the People's Hall at an agricultural event, and there was a gentleman from Washington State who was an entrepreneur. He was making a huge living selling chicken paws because the feet and the leg of the chicken, delicacy. Well, we throw it away. And he was shipping thousands of tons over to China and making a huge living doing that because it's interesting, in many parts of the world, items that we throw away, they like. And when you discover that, hey, that's great, because then we can make money off something that's been waste material before.
I'm at the point now where I'd like to change gears here again, and for the rest of our discussion, and I think we've got lots to talk about, but to kind of go through some of the issues that are out there currently. And there's none bigger right now then this whole discussion about ethanol and fuel and the discussion about, well, is this fuel?
Food versus fuel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I want to start with a quote here. And again, Samuelson says has been a wonderful source of information for me. This one is by Jim Rapp. I'm sure you recognize this one. And his quote said, in terms of this debate, "The rapid growth of ethanol industry tells you all you need to know about its performance and viability. It burns cleaner, thus fighting air pollution. Ask the American Lung Association. It's made here at home, providing jobs. Just ask the 230,000 people already employed as a result of ethanol plant construction, operation-related support services. It provides more dollars into our local communities. Just ask the local business owners about the increased dollars spent at their stores." Well, that gets us started into a very lively and a big debate. And I'll turn it over to you.
Food versus fuel last year was totally blown out of proportion, and I did a lot of Samuelson Says on that, and got a lot of emails and phone calls from people saying, it's just not right to take food from hungry people and put it into the tanks of our gas-guzzling SUVs, and we need to stop that. We would respond by saying we can produce the corn for the ethanol, and once we've taken the ethanol out of that bushel of corn, we still have a high-protein livestock feed in corn gluten. We still have the corn sweetener that is going into the soda pops and the other uses for sweetener in this country. And we don't throw that bushel of corn away, so we are not taking food out of the mouths of hungry people. And secondly, if there is a demand for more corn for ethanol, we can grow it. We have that capability in this country. We've got the technology. We have the genetic enhancement of various crops, and we can do it. What was really irritating, nobody wanted to blame oil for the increase in food price. They were all critical of the ethanol and biodiesel situation. And I kept saying, if you want to look at the real reason for the increase in food prices, look at oil, crude oil.
Well, let's put some markers. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's put some markers out there for people who might be watching this quite a ways down the road.
Right.
Let's ask you about the price of oil going into this, where it started and where it peaked, and then where we're at today. And today again is February 2009. And then do the same thing for corn and soybeans. And I think you could also make an analogy for rice and wheat and other products. So,
well, the peaks on the upside happened early in 2008 and continued into early summer of 2008. And then the valleys came in the last 6 months of 2008.
Where did we start with oil, though, at the beginning of this increase?
Oh, we were probably at about $75 or $80. I can remember when there was talk, oh my golly, if we go to $75, that's really serious. And then in July it went to $147. And there were a lot of analysts saying it's going to $200. And it prompted a lot of farmers to go into the futures market and buy the fuel they needed, whether it was diesel or gasoline, for what they do, and because they were convinced that it is going to $200 a barrel. And I started to think that my rule of prices never go the same way forever would be broken by oil, because nobody could conceive that oil would go the other direction. And then starting after that $147 peak, it started down, and it went straight down to $32 a barrel at one point. Now that's bringing a projection about 3 weeks ago from an oil trader who says he thinks gasoline will be $1 a gallon average in 2009. I don't think it will be, but this whole picture of going straight up, and it happened with corn, it happened with wheat, happened with soybeans, cattle, hogs, all of the commodities. And the thing we have to remember now in trading, because speculators got a lot of bad knocks in this whole thing, it was the speculators that were driving it up. And yeah, they were involved, but speculators also drive it down when it goes the other way. And speculators provide liquidity in the market because they'll take risks on the other side of a trend. If there weren't speculators, farmers couldn't go into the market and hedge their corn and hedge their wheat and soybeans because there's got to be somebody there to take the other side of it. So we saw all of this happening, and then the bottom just dropped out of the market. Fertilizer prices based on petroleum, reached $1,000 a ton. And that drove farmers, hey, we better lock it in because if petroleum goes to $200, why, it'll be $1,500 a ton. A lot of them locked it in at that level, and then the bottom fell out of the fertilizer market.
Well, talk about the corresponding rise in especially corn and soybeans, if you could.
We saw corn and you talked about perfect storm. There was the perfect storm that came about really was the sudden growth in agricultural products for fuel. The short crops in countries like Brazil that saw a smaller crop, Argentina and Australia, and to some extent we saw a smaller crop in this country. So you had a growth in demand and you had a declining supply. It really was the law of supply and demand. And maybe the speculators did drive it beyond reality at a point there because, and oil the same way, because the other thing that happened that made it difficult for farmers, mutual funds or those funds that broaden their portfolio, when they look at stocks, they're looking at paper. And when you get into nervous times economically, wartime particularly, people like to have something they can hold, whether it be gold, oil, soybeans, wheat, or whatever. And so they began bundling into the portfolio a commodity bundle, and it included oil and wheat and cattle and hogs all together, which then really tied agricultural products to the price of oil and to the price of the other metals and the commodities that came into the bundle. So that probably drove the speculative side as well. Growing demand in foreign markets. And all of this came together at one time.
So where did the corn and soybeans start 2 or 3 years ago?
Oh, we'd sell corn out of the field at $1.90 a bushel. And some down to $1.50, $1.40 a bushel. And soybeans, $5, when soybeans hit $8 for the first time, my golly, people couldn't believe it.
Where do those prices peak?
Well, corn on the futures market got close to $8 because of an unusual situation in wheat that occurred on the Minneapolis market during the peak of the wheat market last year in early 2008. We saw wheat go up to $24 a bushel. Normal price for wheat is $4, $3, somewhere in there. And it's now back to $5.50 a bushel. Corn is back below $4 a bushel after getting close to $8. Soybeans that got up in the $15, $16 a bushel range, now trading back at $9, which compared to 2 or 3 years ago is a very good price. But it isn't a good price when you've got fertilizer prices and fuel prices where they are.
And we've talked about that farmer out there gambling. He gambled that fuel prices would stay high.
Would go up. And so now he's paying because he locked it in, so you got to pay it. And now diesel has come down, gasoline has come down, and I would say that the biggest challenge an American farmer has today and in the future is not how to produce, but how to market.
Yeah. This is a good place to stop very briefly. Okay. You have to take a break, and we're just getting into this whole ethanol. And we've been talking about ethanol and the many sides of that debate. Food versus fuel is where we started. From your comments, I would guess that you don't buy the notion that peasants in India and in Mexico are starving because of us deciding to make ethanol in this country.
No, I don't think so at all. As a matter of fact, if we had the transportation system, I don't think we would have malnutrition on the planet. But the problem is we can't get it to the people who need it. And the other problem we have is there are those countries like Ethiopia and North Korea whose leaders control the population by saying, if you're with me, you get food. If you're not, tough. Mm-hmm. So, no, I don't think that ethanol or biodiesel has had really any impact on availability of food.
Okay. Another side of that ethanol debate has been on whether or not it's an efficient way to create fuel. I wonder if you can address your thoughts on that.
Well, the research that says it isn't goes back to the 1980s, a professor at Cornell University who came out with research saying that it took more energy to produce ethanol than the ethanol ultimately produced. Most scientists who have worked on the ethanol project or the alternative fuels project say it was faulty research, that the conclusion that was reached by this professor was faulty because of the way the research was conducted, that it actually, ethanol does produce more energy. And unfortunately, the opponents of ethanol pull that research out. And today, with the techniques that we have involved in production of ethanol, we are far more efficient, producing far more energy from ethanol than it takes to produce the ethanol.
The figures I've heard, and you can challenge these, mm-hmm. They're a perfect opportunity to set the record straight,
right,
is that it takes, for 1 gallon of fuel inputs, mm-hmm. you can get about 1.3 gallons of ethanol.
I think it's up to 1.5 or 1.6 with the new refining techniques. I know it's over 1.5. And so that has changed. And then the other argument against ethanol is it uses so much water. There is an ethanol plant in the middle of the desert southwest of Phoenix, Arizona that I have visited, and they recycle all of the water. So it is, once it is done, what it does in production of ethanol, they turn it back into steam, then they condense it and they circulate the water back and forth. So you're not, and in the desert you couldn't afford to use that much water.
But you can't possibly talk about ethanol production without talking about, well, why don't we produce more oil domestically? Because we have the capability of doing that. Your reaction, you're already smiling.
I don't know why we don't. I really don't know why. We got the first warning back in the 70s. At that time, we were importing, 35 to 40% of our energy in foreign oil. Today, we're over 60% of our energy in imported oil. And back in that oil embargo of the 70s, we said, that's it. We're going to find ways that we can cut our use of foreign oil. We've increased it. We've increased it dramatically. That's why I'm a strong advocate of biodiesel, a strong advocate of ethanol, because it does cut our dependence on foreign oil. It is grown on American farms. It is processed by American workers, and you don't have to haul it on a ship and take the risk of an Exxon Valdez in contaminating Mother Nature. To me, it just makes sense. If we have the ability to do it, and we have the mandate now that we have to be up to 15 billion gallons of ethanol by the year 2015, and we can do that without taking food away from people.
Where are we at now?
We're at 10.6 billion as of 2008. But the worst thing that can happen to the ethanol industry is for the price of oil to drop. And it's dropped. And so we have seen one major company file for bankruptcy, Verasun, and they have about 16 plants, and they've closed 4 of them. Just word this week that a company in Wisconsin is going to close 4 of its 9 ethanol plants because price of oil is down, and so now we don't worry so much about the cost of foreign fuel and energy. And I'm afraid that we're going to go right back to where we did after the 70s and forget about it and say, okay, why should we put all that money into countries who don't like us and probably use a lot of what we pay to foster terrorists, and instead of doing it here in this country? I just don't buy this whole argument that we ought not be doing this, because it has revitalized American agriculture. It really turned, after President Bush mentioned ethanol in State of the Union address 2006, To me, that was a hallmark turning point in the acceptance of ethanol. Next day, we had Warren Buffett saying, "What is this?" We had Bill Gates saying, "What is this?" And it brought ethanol to the forefront after 30 years of trying to get Congress to say, we can grow a lot more of our energy here.
But part of that revitalization was the upward movement of corn and soybean prices.
Correct.
So then you get back to that whole argument about food versus fuel.
I don't. I don't think there is an argument. And what was really irritating, we had the American Bakers Association march on Capitol Hill February 27th of 2008 because wheat prices had gotten to the level where it was going to put the entire baking industry out of business. And they went to the White House and they went to the Secretary and said, you've got to fix this because we're going bankrupt. And they said the reason for that is that there is a shortage of wheat, and because people are putting corn into ethanol, they're using some wheat to feed livestock, and they came up with all the argument. But the entire reason they gave for raising bread prices was the price of wheat. Okay, wheat has come down about 2/3. And if that's the only reason for the increase in bread prices, then why hasn't the price of bread come down 2/3? Corn, in a $3.69 box of corn flakes, when corn was at almost $8 a bushel, the value of the corn in a box of corn at Kellogg's Corn Flakes, 11 cents. Now the price of corn is half, less than half of what it was last fall. And so now the value of corn in that Kellogg's corn box is 5 cents. But I haven't seen the price of cornflakes drop. Milk, another example. Price of milk is 50% lower than it was last summer. I haven't seen the price of milk drop 50 cents. So the Samuelson Says challenge that I shoot out at the food industry and the processors is, if you're going to blame agriculture and the cost of the raw commodities solely for the reason you're increasing price, then when that price of the raw commodity goes down, then you should also say, we're going to lower the price to this level. And what was really irritating is the grocery manufacturers of America, the very people that depend on the producer for the raw material that they process, sell, and make a profit on, they spent millions of dollars fostering the food versus fuel, trying to convince voters that we should change the renewable fuel standard, that we should lower the figures on how much ethanol we need under the renewable fuel standard. And they spent millions of dollars. Finally, Deere and Monsanto and ADM and some other companies said, hey, we got to help farmers on this one. And so they put a lot of dollars into a campaign, basically fostered in Washington to hit the members of Congress. Wait a minute, this isn't right. So I don't see this food versus fuel thing as having any reality at all.
Let me throw you a softball here. At least I think it's a softball. When those prices were sky high for corn and soybeans and wheat, were the food manufacturers able to maintain any profitability?
Well, I did a Samuelson Says on that in November of last year, and we looked at the earnings reports of Kellogg's and General Mills and every food processing company we looked at, and I think there were 6 or 7, all showed an increase in profit. Despite these higher ingredient costs that they were really moaning about, they all showed an increase in profit, and some of them were sizable increases in profit in the third quarter of last year when we were in the middle of all this.
So maybe they're even making more profit now that...
Oh, they've got to, because they're not cutting the price. I haven't seen the box of corn flakes get any cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to, again, the ethanol discussion. Part of the challenge in ethanol and whether or not it's an efficient way of producing fuel is it gets us back to Brazil. And it gets us back to a more efficient way of producing ethanol. At least that's the challenge, and that would be with sugarcane.
Right.
Your reaction to that side of it?
Brazil has probably done a better job of converting the fuel needs in that country to ethanol. Well, I would say has done a better job than any other country in the world. They use sugarcane. And because they had, and again, part of this was surplus supplies. What are we going to do with this?
But part of that whole discussion is, well, what is it that creates ethanol? It's sugar, and obviously sugarcane has a much higher percentage than corn.
Right. And we don't do sugar in this country. First of all, we don't grow enough sugarcane to do it. But the Farm Bill of 2008 is putting in the biggest amount of research dollars in the alternative fuels program to come up with cellulosic. And we now have switchgrass, miscanthus, which is a crop that's being grown at the University of Illinois. It's a perennial and it grows on poor land. But to do that, you have to generate an entire system. So it doesn't happen overnight, because you have to develop planting equipment, you have to develop harvesting equipment, you have to develop storage. How do you store the stuff? Because you can't process it all at one time. And then the processing side of it is totally different than using corn as the product. But the mandate in the 2008 Farm Bill is to move into cellulosic production of ethanol, and Poet, which is the largest maker of ethanol in the country, has a plant, I think it's in South Dakota, that has been online now doing just cellulosic. And you can take trees, and you can take plants that are grown specifically for it. So that's the direction. We will be moving away from corn, because farmers do react. And while they were irritated by the food versus fuel argument, they thought, okay, we better find other ways so that we don't have to put up with this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we have seen it time and again. Back in the 70s, when people were so upset about using pesticides and insecticides, millions of tons on corn and soybeans and wheat to kill pests that would otherwise kill the crop. And people said, we got to quit using this stuff. It's poison. You got to stop using it. Well, it wasn't poison, but farmers looked at that and said, okay, they're going to come at us, and they're the boss. And so today we have genetic modification, enhancement, I call it, the GMOs, genetically modified organisms, I call it genetically enhanced, that in the case of the European corn borer, which really destroys a lot of corn, they have inserted a gene into that corn plant, and the only thing it does is make that plant unpalatable to the moth that lays the eggs. So it doesn't affect the quality of the corn and nutrients in the corn. No effect other than it has cut down almost entirely the use of an insecticide to kill that moth before it lays its eggs. Potato beetle, another prime example. Colorado potato beetle that would destroy potatoes if you didn't spray them. Well, they altered a gene in the potato plant, doesn't affect the production of potatoes. But if you go to Epcot in Florida and the land display down there, you'll see a graphic demonstration, a clear acrylic case with two potato plants in pots in there. One has been altered genetically, the other one hasn't, and then they put Colorado potato beetles inside the case, and within 2 days the unaltered plant is gone. The altered plant hasn't been touched. So now we're getting argument, and it drives farmers crazy. They don't know where to go. They don't want you to use insecticides. Okay, we have worked around that. Now they say, oh, you can't fool with Mother Nature. You can't genetically modify these plants, because who knows what that might do to us 30 years down the road. Well, they tell me when electricity came to rural America, there were those who said it'll sterilize the men and it'll sterilize bulls and it'll give you all kinds of problems. Nobody knows what's down the road. But I come back to something that I say over and over. We have to maintain science as a benchmark. If we allow emotion to take over, then we're in big trouble, because science must be the benchmark. But it frustrates farmers, because what do? Now you've got the European Union saying, oh, we don't want any of this GMO stuff. Well, when you get a country like Zimbabwe, whose people are starving to death, and we ship them 25,000 tons of corn to help feed their people, and they say, well, it's genetically, yeah, it is. Oh, we can't eat that, so we let our people starve. rather than take a chance that 50 years down the road they'll be born with one eye or something. I don't know. Now I'm emotional, and I should stay to science, but it's just so frustrating.
These are incredibly emotional issues, and it's interesting. In the last year and a half, suddenly food production has gotten to the forefront of our discussion about the news. It's just
it has, and maybe that in the long run will benefit agriculture.
Back to the ethanol issue and this whole debate about whether or not it's efficient. A lot of people, economists, would say, well, how, and people in a particular political stripe perhaps, how can we say it's efficient when we subsidize by 51 cents per gallon in a tax credit, and then we block Brazilian ethanol to come in at a rate of 54-cent tariff on it?
Right. I agree with that. I think we need to phase it out. Now, I understand why we did it. It's a new industry, and it takes a tremendous investment to build an ethanol plant. And I think that while the industry is relatively new, and really it is the last 5 or 6 years, which is a new industry, and they're right now going through a very challenging time, I think you need to give them that protection. Now, if we were the only country with trade protection, then I would say no. But when you look at what we're up against with other countries on many other products, so, but I editorialized late last year saying it's time to begin phasing out the 51 cent a gallon and the 54 cent import tariff. That it's going to have to stand on its own. But I don't want to phase it out until we phase out all of the subsidies for the oil industry, because we are competing with that industry. And you take a look at the subsidies that go into the oil industry every year.
Can you talk specifics on those?
I don't have them in front of me now, but I've done a Samuelson says on it, and the subsidies, the overall subsidy for the oil industry is much larger than the overall subsidy for the ethanol industry. I mean, we've done all sorts of things, and still we can't get the oil companies to build refineries. But again, that comes back to environmental rules. We badly need refineries in this country, but where can you build one?
And I will certainly get to a more thorough discussion of environmental issues, because I know that's another one that's near and dear to your heart. You think about some of the debate we've had about fuel production, and a lot of it has been about offshore oil drilling, and the comments, well, it would take us 5 to 10 years before that gets up to production in the first place. And I'm sure the oilmen would say, again, that's where we need the subsidies to support that.
And had we started doing that in 1974, we'd be producing a lot of the petroleum that we need.
And now we're back to the environmental issues. Okay, let's go to more discussion about the whole commodity price, and maybe we've talked about that quite a bit. Let's take a different look at that in terms of some of the closed markets. Your reaction to places like Cuba in particular, that's been a closed market for a long time.
It's been totally ridiculous to have the embargo since 1962. I went to Cuba in 1999, I think it was, when Governor Orion of Illinois became the first governor to go to Cuba in 40 years. And I was invited to go along and went to Cuba. And talking to the Cuban people, they said, oh, we love that Texas long grain rice. That was our favorite rice. Now we're getting rice from Vietnam, and we don't like it. We'd love to get that Texas long grain rice back into the market. And I look at Cuba 90 miles off our shore. They produce sugar and some fruits, but they don't produce much in the way of meat or milk. Matter of fact, we went out to a dairy farm that was a commune farm, and talking to the manager there, he almost had tears in his eyes when he said, I wish I could bring the Holstein genetics from the U.S., because he said this herd was started half a century ago with genetics from the United States. Now he said, I can't do it. And he said, not only that, but I can't import the grain to feed these animals to get top production out of them. And to me, embargoes never work unless you are solely in control of whatever it is you're embargoing. But here was Cuba with every other country in the world trading with it. Cuba was getting its soybeans from Brazil. It was getting wheat from Canada. It was getting rice from Vietnam. It was getting poultry from France. It was getting everything it needed. And here we are, 90 miles away on the airplane going down, and I sat next to Alan Andreas of ADM. And I said, how frustrating is it for you? And he said, every day we have ships coming out of the Gulf that go right by Cuba with everything they need, and we can't stop. And so I have hopes that under President Obama we will open up. Under President Bush, and that was a political thing, I think, because the American-Cuban population in Florida.
Yeah, that Cuban lobby in Florida.
That Cuban lobby, and Mr. Bush needed Florida in the election, as did his brother. And so I think that was a good part of it, but he wouldn't even talk about it. And finally he was convinced that, okay, we can sell them food if there is no credit involved. If it's cash on the barrelhead, we can sell them food. And we have, since that happened earlier in this decade, we've, I think, sold $2.6 billion worth of food to Cuba. But they would buy more if credit were involved. And they'd certainly get that Texas long grain rice that they really want in there. And it just doesn't make sense. We imposed the embargo to get Castro out of there. He's still there.
Well, Raul's there. And perhaps we've got a new administration. Perhaps that new administration will change things too.
There has been an indication that the dialogue will open. The other indication I've seen is we will not immediately lift the embargo. But we embargoed wheat sales under Jimmy Carter to Russia, and because we were going to teach them a lesson on Afghanistan, and every other country produced wheat, sold it.
Well, you had already talked about genetically modified GMOs?
GMOs.
Organisms, is that
right?
Okay. A little bit, and again, you can't talk about that without talking about world markets. So let's talk about the GMOs and tell us a little bit about what we have been able to do, both in terms of plants and animals in that respect.
Well, Earl Butz, when he was Secretary of Agriculture, often said, the worst thing than biting into an apple and finding a worm is to bite into an apple and find half a worm. Meaning the other half of it is in your mouth. And he said, without technology and the ability to destroy the bugs and the pests that will destroy a crop, or the plant disease that will destroy a crop, our food prices would be higher and food quality would be far less. And I'm not going to get into an argument with organic farmers. I have no trouble with what they're doing, but I don't subscribe to the theory that total organic farming would produce enough food to feed the world and to feed us. That I do not accept, and I don't think it's an argument they should use. But if people are willing to pay more, and I'm not one of them, but if people are, and that farmer gets more for what he produces, hey, more power to him. So it's a fast-growing segment of the market. It's a niche market, and fine, take advantage of it. But again, we come back to technology that has enabled us to bring corn production up to an average of 154 bushels an acre in 2008, with many farmers producing over 200 bushels to the acre, and soybeans that have lagged, I think, in production increase, but we're working on it. And then when I look at what Monsanto is getting ready to introduce, a drought-resistant corn, where again they have altered genes, and anybody who's gone to the Farm Progress Show the last 2 years has had an opportunity to see the test plots, because they go in and they plant the stuff, and then they hold water off a certain part of it, and the other part gets what would be a normal rainfall. And they're looking at the moment, and Rob Fraley at Monsanto says this is just the beginning. They're looking at a 15% increase in corn production in a drought because of what they have done to alter the plant to make it not only survive but thrive on less water. Well, think what that means to Africa. Think what that could mean to India, where if you have dry areas, you could plant this variety and you could produce more. And to me, this is just the beginning. As far as livestock, the embryo transplants, there was a time when if you bought breeding stock, if you bought heifers and bulls, you had to literally ship the animals to get the pedigree and the genetics. That's the early Cuban Holstein industry. That's what you shipped the animal. Now, you take a vial of embryos, you take a vial of semen, and semen from a bull that's been dead for 20 years, but you freeze it and you maintain it and you use it to artificially inseminate a cow, and it gives you the pedigree that says this breeding produces more milk or produces better quality meat. The increase we have seen in nutrition in beef and pork and poultry has been phenomenal. We have gotten about as close as you can get to getting a pound of poultry meat for a pound of feed. They're working toward that, and again, it's all science, and the emotion that says, "Oh, we can't eat that; it might hurt us."
The public seems to get a little bit more nervous, though, when you talk about genetic modifications in animals, where you take you take some trait from one animal and you there into another one.
Yeah, definitely, because then the next step is a human, and I think that's why there is emotional opposition, and I understand, that if
that would be an ethical boundary you would not be in favor of crossing.
Livestock, I'd have no problem. Humans, I'd have a real problem. I really would. But
it's currently not going on for livestock. Is that correct?
It is experimentally. Cloning is a prime example, and several.
But only experimentally.
Experimentally, but the USDA and the FDA have said that milk from cloned cows is safe, and so the approval is there from a safety standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, I don't think it is. Several years ago at World Ag Expo, there was a company there that had cloned 12 dairy calves. And it was absolutely fascinating. Every calf looked exactly like the next one. I mean, there was no difference in appearance at all. And every calf, when it reached production age, was producing the same level of high-quality milk. And, we've seen the cloned pony, and we've seen the cloned sheep. Now we're seeing cloned dogs. And the ability, apparently, to take DNA from your pet and create a new one.
It just hit the news. I think some woman paid $140,000 to clone her beloved dog.
Her beloved dog, yes. But the scary thing there for a lot of people is that, okay, now they're going to do it with humans. And, there could be scientific reason to do it. If your family has a cancer trait, maybe you alter some of your genes and it'll remove the cancer trait. We don't know yet, but I'm sure somebody out there is looking at it and talking about it.
Yeah, I'm sure our society will get into that lively debate here in the next few years.
And it will be lively, very much so. And I think it'll take some time to make any serious change in the thinking on that.
One of the things you hear in terms of criticism about everything that's happening is in the seed side, for example,
right,
is that we're going to get to the point where we have only a small number of seeds, and if, God forbid, something should happen, a new organism hits that wipes out entire crops across the world. Your concerns on that?
I remember several years ago when we had a corn disease. This is probably 20 years ago. We had a corn disease, rust, that hit, and the initial reaction was, "Oh my God, this is going to destroy the corn crop." By the end of that crop year, we had crop varieties that we'd grown in Hawaii and in Argentina and brought the seed back here that took it totally out of the problem. It was a one-year problem. Sent corn prices higher, because we were not going to be able to grow corn. It was a corn blight, and we came up with genetic changes, and we heard about it one year and it was gone. Asian rust in soybeans that has come up here from Brazil, carried in here on the winds. A couple of years ago, there was a major concern that this was going to take over the soybean crop. Some of the chemical companies produced a tremendous amount of anti-rust chemical in preparation, and it never happened. We maybe get 2 or 3 cases reported a year, and that it just has never happened. Just like I'll probably regret this as I lie on my bed dying of bird flu, but I think bird flu is not the concern that it should be. I really don't. We're spending billions of dollars to avoid the pandemic, and last I saw, I think it was like 215 people have died on the planet from bird flu. And that's people who kiss chickens on the mouth and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, since we're in the neighborhood, the cow that killed Christmas.
Oh, yeah. Well, it started with the cow in Alberta, Canada. That was the first discovery in this country of BSE, bovine spongiform encephalitis, I think is the correct terminology for it. It had ravaged the herds in England.
And what's it otherwise known as? We should get that out.
Mad cow disease.
Okay.
Yeah, mad cow disease. And it is a disease that destroys the nervous system, and we had the video that's been played over and over and over again of the cow that we found not being able to stand and falling down and that sort of thing, because that's what it does. And then the concern is that it is transmissible to humans if you eat the meat, and it develops Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. I have yet to have a medical person tell me with 100% assurance that it is transferable. Some have said, yeah, we're 80% sure. But I have not gotten a 100% sure from anybody. And while I have heard from listeners who said, I had a cousin who lived in England, came to this country, and died of mad cow disease, I always respond by saying, can you send me a copy of the death certificate? I'd like to see what they put. And generally that's the end of it. But a couple did, and it was not, cause of death was not listed as mad cow induced. But I've said many times that the biggest non-story I've had to cover is the mad cow story, because the day that cow in Canada was discovered, the next day cattle futures down the limit, stock in Burger King, McDonald's, and other beef companies sharply lower, because nobody was ever going to eat beef again. Nobody would ever dare to eat it, and so the beef, it's the end of the beef world.
Well, to a certain extent, correct me if I'm wrong here, that caused an immediate reaction in places like Japan and South Korea, did it not?
Countries closed the border all over, and to this day they're not fully reopened because in Japan, they were our biggest beef buyer before this happened. And today they will accept beef from animals 21 months or younger.
From the United States market.
From the United States. South Korea, they're up to 30 months of age or younger. But there really is no reason to just shut off the export market anymore. Canada has probably discovered another dozen cases. In this country, I think we have maybe found 2 or 3. And that comes back to the National Animal Identification System that we ought to have, so that we know where these animals are and where they have been. But England, that was hit hardest by mad cow disease, and it literally destroyed their beef industry for a while. And then, of course, foot and mouth disease. That was just horrible over there. We haven't had an outbreak of that since 1929 in this country. And that's why it's critical that we do everything we can to keep it out. But I think it's around 260 people that have died in England from Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and so some people say that's from eating mad cow beef. Mm-hmm. Others say no, it's not. And to me, it's a non-story.
if I understand, maybe this is a cultural thing, that in South Korea at least, and maybe the same is true in Japan, that in some cases the diet includes the beef brain.
True. But it also, the spinal column and the brain is also a part of the Mexican diet. But we have no restrictions on exporting beef to Mexico.
And
it's a lot of it is protecting the domestic beef industry.
I'm shocked. And I think some of the restrictions are that they'll accept our beef if it includes none of the spinal column.
Right. And when we finally opened the South Korean market, it was open for 2 months, and a shipment shows up over there with part of the spinal column in it. I'm not sure it was in it when it left here. It may have suddenly appeared when it got to Korea, because their cattle producers, were just adamant that they not accept our. It almost brought the government down last fall. Because the head of the government, the president of South Korea, said all science says there is nothing wrong with this. And there were demonstrations that went on for a week, and there was revolt against him in the parliament, and it almost brought the government down until he said, "Okay, we'll back away." And so we finally have started shipping beef in small amounts, and basically it's the muscle cuts, which is the other point to make. Mad cow disease is not found in the muscle cuts, which is where you get your steaks. It's found in the ground beef and in the spinal column in there. But we have finally started to get some of the high-end beef back into South Korea. But it's an unbelievable negotiation.
Yeah. And there was another market where they're increasing taste for meat and meat products.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
You've talked about this a couple of times, but I want to talk about in a little bit more length the incredibly emotional issue of tracing animals. And I want you to explain, first of all, why that's important. What's the dynamic that causes that to come to play?
Well, we just talked about mad cow disease. Mm-hmm. And
I guess I'm looking at why is it an issue in the first place, and that these animals move around from place to place?
They do move around from place to place, and we have COOL at the moment, country of origin labeling. Well, it's not unusual for an animal to be born on this side of the border and then moved into Canada for feeding out and then brought back here for slaughter. And so how do you label that animal? Is it U.S. or is it Canadian? And that's a separate issue. But on the national animal ID issue, basically it's the feeling on the part of farmers who don't trust government people very much. And they just think that, first of all, you have to register your location. This now is a voluntary procedure, and I think maybe half of the animal producers in the United States have registered their location. We then look at a rancher who says, "Oh, well, okay, they know what I'm doing, they know what I've got, they can use it to check against my tax returns. And why should government have to know exactly how many animals I have here anyway? It's none of their business. I'm a free enterprise producer." So a lot of it is the big brother mentality. Washington is watching us for reasons other than traceability.
Is there a profitability aspect to the argument? Does it cost more to be able to track these animals?
Yeah, and that's another concern. Who's going to pay for it? Is the federal government going to pay for the tracking? Is the rancher or the farmer going to pay for the tracking? Is the consumer going to pay because it'll be a safety factor for them in case there's an outbreak of something? And so in the minds of a lot of those who oppose it, there is this emotional factor that will affect them. There is also a financial factor. Who's going to pay for it? That question gets asked a lot. And then the other thing is, they initially tried to do it as mandatory and found out that wasn't going to work because It would involve horses. It would involve all animals. And that meant if a family had a 4-H kid with two steers, they'd have to register. And those steers would have to be identified. And if you had horses, they would have to be, maybe you have pleasure horses, 2 of them, in a suburb that allows horses. You'd have to register your premise, and you would have to have those horses identified. And then there's the tracking system, and there are several companies that are ready to jump in because they see a real opportunity to make money, which there would be, because 60 million hogs, 100 million cattle, plus all of the other animals that you have. There would be, it would be a complicated procedure, but once in place, I think, as I mentioned earlier, farmers who produce beans or carrots for Gerber baby food, they have to keep track of every acre. They have them plotted out on a map that Gerber's has and they have. And whatever they do on that acre, the day they put fertilizer on, the day they put any crop protection on, and the day they plant the crop, and the day they harvest the crop, that all has to be totally recorded by the producer. And the event that there's a recall of Gerber baby food, they know exactly where to go. They can go right to the farm. And livestock people are pretty independent people.
And maybe that's part of their genetic code, huh?
I think it is. They a lot of them just have a problem, and I have emails that will let you know how they feel, because I say I think it's necessary, because I think it benefits the industry. When we had the tomato recall, last year, it shut down the whole industry. And had we known and been able to trace where those tomatoes came from, you could have shut down that farm or that processing plant, and the rest of the industry could have then moved forward. But it took 3 weeks to find the source of it. It turned out to be Mexico. And
devastated a lot of the producers.
Devastated them, because you can't keep a tomato when it's ripe. You harvest, and if nobody is eating tomatoes, and everybody that use tomatoes in food processing, particularly the Mexican community and all of that they do, they just stopped buying them. Didn't want to take a chance. The peanut thing that is just now coming to a conclusion. It's taken a long time.
How much of this whole discussion about tracing both plants and animals and their production, what's linked with foreign markets as well?
Well, some people see it as a benefit for our exports. For example, if we could tell a Japanese meat buyer we know exactly where this meat came from, so that if you are concerned, we can show you, what it was fed and everything. And there are ranchers that are doing that, and there are some markets, I think in Oklahoma and Kansas, where they have markets just for fully traceable, identified animals. Foreign buyers, in some cases, are willing to pay more for that beef, and are willing to buy it, where if it's not identified, they probably wouldn't buy it and certainly wouldn't pay more. But there's not enough financial increase yet to get a lot of producers, I think, excited about it.
Part of the problems in marketing GMO foods has been in Europe. Do you see that changing?
Not as long as Greenpeace is active. That's basically a Greenpeace project. We see there was a recent action taken by the ministers, the agricultural ministers in the European Union, saying that they would allow some more GMO corn to come into Europe, and then it moved to the higher level in the official pecking order, and they said, no, we're not ready yet. And it's basically because of consumers, but farmers are getting more upset all the time because it's hampering their production. They can't use the genetics for the European corn borer, for example, and they can't use some of the technology that we have, and they feel it puts them at a disadvantage in the world market, and they're right.
How about the challenges it presents to American producers, especially the grain, where you've got one field that doesn't have GMO grain, and the next field that does, and then wind and nature takes its course.
It depends on what the technology is. There is some technology. As a matter of fact, the Monsanto research that they have displayed at the Farm Progress Show, they have to be very careful about that, and they put it in an area where the wind can't affect it and that sort of thing until they get it approved by USDA.
I'm my memory is failing me here, but wasn't there an incident just a couple years ago where there was a big question that it was supposed to be non-GMO grain, and they found traces where it was?
Japan. It was a load that we shipped to Japan, and it was a shipment of corn, and they discovered that it had some GMO in it, and so they rejected it. And
we're probably not talking about a couple thousand bushels of grain.
No, we're not. No, we're talking about a boatload. We're talking about several thousand tons. And I'm not sure if that was brought back here and fed to livestock or if it was dumped. I don't know.
Okay. Let's talk about the role that the extension services and things like the soybean checkoff and others have in making these products more marketable and finding other ways that they can be used as well.
Extension Service would not be involved in that, but the commodity organizations would be, and I think there are probably 50 or 60 commodities in this country now that have checkoff programs.
Well, first of all, explain how the checkoff programs work.
Depends on if you're looking at a soybean checkoff, the percentage of money that goes to the United Soybean Board is based on the price. So if it's soybeans are $15, you're going to get a lot more money into the United Soybean Board than when they're $8.
Is that a federal agency?
No. This is a farmer agency. The way it works, corn grower, soybean growers, dairy farmers, beef producers, pork producers, almond producers, various commodities, the growers get together and say, we need to do something to help us research and promote and advertise our product. So they put together a plan for a checkoff program, and they then submit that to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They'll make revisions. It'll come back to the organization. Let me take National Cattlemen's Beef Association because that convention just ended, and they did take some action there to increase the checkoff. So we'll take that one, and so it comes back to the Cattlemen's Beef Board, and they say, okay, we can accept this change. Let's talk about this one. Finally, they come up with a checkoff program. In the case of the cattle industry, every time an animal is sold, $1 is collected by the buyer and shipped to the Cattlemen's Beef Board to promote beef. And so they have put that together, and then it goes to all of the producers in a referendum. And the producers will vote yes or no. And if enough of them vote yes, then it becomes reality, and then you begin checking off $1 a head. Well, with inflation over the years, they now think they need $2 a head. So the recommendation out of this last meeting in Phoenix a week ago will go to Washington saying we'd like to increase to $2 a head. The USDA will look at it and say, okay, that's fine with us. And then it again goes to a referendum. So it's a rather complicated procedure to get it set up. Now, once you get the funds coming in, then you use it on research to improve the quality of the meat. There's a program, the Checkoff Dollars Fund, called Beef Quality Assurance Program, that works with producers to make sure that the animals are treated humanely and that their vaccinations take place in a way that's not going to destroy any of the meat of the animal carcass or the hide or that sort of thing. And then you've got the promotion. They work with the food service industry to get them to, use more beef cuts in schools and hospitals and in restaurants. They work with the retailers of meat to come up with new cuts. And one of the important things they've done over the last 5 years is they have developed probably between 10 and 15 new cuts from lesser quality parts of the animal. And flat iron steak is a good example. That comes from a part of the animal that was not really all that tender, but with breeding work and with production work, it is tender and it sells very well. It comes up with the beef, it's what's for dinner. Pork industry came up with the other white meat, one of the most recognized taglines in advertising history. The milk industry got milk, and the milk mustache, and all of that. All of that comes out of checkoff dollars. There is no government money involved. Mm-hmm. It is just producer money, and it has dramatically changed the consumption and the use of the various products. And in the beef industry, when the Canada situation hit, with mad cow disease, the Canadian beef industry was really hit hard. The American beef industry watched that one very carefully and saw what was right and what was wrong. And when we found the cow that killed Christmas, the impact probably lasted 2 weeks. We were prepared. Checkoff dollars were in place to immediately get out to media and to get to the consumer saying, this is not a problem. The meat never entered the food system. And we did not see cattle go to limit down. We did not see stock of Tyson's and McDonald's fall sharply. So those checkoff dollars, I think, proved that had the producers not been involved, it probably wouldn't have been done.
Well, a big part of it, you'd already talked about the importance that they have in terms of the research. And I guess my confusion with whether or not this was a federal program was, am I correct to say that a lot of times their research sites are co-located with these land-grant colleges?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they work with the land-grant colleges because the Cattlemen's Beef Board is not a research body. No, they have to contract with land-grant universities or, in some cases, commercial research laboratories. And they'll work hand-in-hand with them. You'll find that in the dairy industry and in the pork industry where the research is done in many cases by land grants, but there are times it's done by research firms that are simply in business to do that.
I must admit a fascination with soybeans and how 60, 70, 80 years ago, who was growing soybeans? And part of my fascination is all the different ways now they found that soybeans is not only this incredibly productive plant to be grown in places like Iowa and Illinois, but all the different uses you have that nobody dreamed about. How much was that a factor of the soybean checkoff program?
Most of it. Soybean checkoff program does two things. Develops foreign markets and with offices in various parts of the world. And so the development of export markets is an important part of the beef checkoff, the pork checkoff, soybeans, corn, you name it. And then the other important part is to find new uses. And when you take a look at soybeans, Henry Ford brought them over here to put into his glass, his automobile glass, to make it safer. And so Henry Ford gets a lot of credit for bringing soybeans to this country.
And who would have known that side of the story?
Right, yeah. And he used it to make the glass laminate so that if there was an accident, the windows would shatter, but they wouldn't cut. So the soybean originally was used for that, and then when you crush the soybean, you get oil, which initially would go into paint and industrial products, and the meal would go to feed livestock. Well, then the checkoff, soybean checkoff, came up with, first of all, the hydrogenated soybean oil, which makes it much more palatable to humans, and it gets a lot of use now in cooking. Soybean ink, that doesn't come off the newspaper. When they were using regular petroleum-based ink, I would say 80% of the newspapers in this country are printed on soybean ink. You've got the soybean snack foods that came out of the research, and on and on. You've got an adhesive that is used in house construction to glue wood together that is better than anything that was on the market. And you've got soybean candles that have developed a big, and it just goes on, and they're continuing to look for new products.
Yeah, that's amazing development.
Yeah.
This is probably a good place to stop. We still have plenty more to talk about, but
Okay.
we'll pick it up in just a couple minutes.
Okay.